Let's talk about route handlers in this video. So you probably know this at this point that in order to make a page publicly accessible, inside of this app directory you create a folder, and then within that folder you can create a page.tsx file. And this will make the page publicly accessible. Now, similar to this file page.tsx, you can create another file called route.ts that will make an API endpoint for that particular route segment. So let me show you. Inside of this app directory, I can create a folder called API, and then inside of this API folder, I will create another folder called posts. And then in this post folder, I will create a file called route.ts. And within this route.ts file, I'm specifying whenever I receive a GET request to this particular route segment, which is API post, fetch all the post. In this case, I'm fetching all the post from one of the files that I've created, post.json. And you could assume in your case, this could be fetching post from database. So we are just essentially fetching the post and then returning a response. So what that means is that if I try to access this API post endpoint, I should be getting that JSON response. Perfect. Now, similar to this get method, which basically handles the get request for this particular route segment, you also have access to a lot of other HTTP methods, and you can see the complete list of all the HTTP methods that are supported in route handlers on the screen right now. They can all listen for different kind of request, and then you can return a custom response accordingly to the client. So one of the things, if you notice carefully, is that inside of this get block, we are using the native response object to send back a response. Nextjs also has advanced version of a request and response that can handle some advanced cases easily. One of the interesting thing that you have to know, in your route handler, whenever you are getting the get request and you are using this response object to return the response, Nextjs is going to catch that route handler, or essentially catch the result of this request, so that whenever a new request comes, it can just essentially send back the fetched data without actually making a fresh request and get the latest data. So let's see that in action. I will first create a build for this project, because in the development server we won't be able to see the caching clearly. I will then start the server. And just to show you, inside of this data directory, I have created this post.json file. And then from this file, I'm basically fetching these posts, which I'm sending back to the client. So if I go to the browser, hit refresh, I want you to notice this title. The title right now says first post. If I go to post.json and change this to something else, that first post title has been changed. Save it, come to the browser, refresh the browser, you can see that we are still getting the old data. And this is happening because of the caching. Now, there are essentially 4 ways to basically opt out of caching in Nextjs route handlers. So let's talk about all of these 4 ways one by one. Okay. So one of the ways you can disable caching is by using a request object. And what that essentially means is that whenever you're using the request object inside of your blocks, Nextjs is not going to cache the request, because now your function needs some real-time information to process something and then return back a response. In this case, I'm just getting the search params. I'm not using these search params for anything. This is just for the demonstration. The only thing that you need to focus on here is that I'm using this request object, right? So let me again make the build for this. Now again, I'm creating the build and starting the server again and again, so that you can clearly see how all of this works in the production server. Okay, so let me start the server. Now we'll go and refresh this one. So just notice the title. First post title has been changed. And this time we'll again go to post.json. We'll change it back to first post. And this time when I try to refresh the page, you'll see that I'm getting the latest data. That means whenever you're using the request object, Nextjs is not going to catch that request, result of that request. Similarly, caching will be disabled if you're using cookies or headers inside of your block. And if you're using cookies, do not forget to import cookies from next headers. This will also disable the caching for this particular HTTP method. Now, the third scenario in which Nextjs is not going to catch the request is when you're using any other HTTP methods except GET. And finally, you can use route segment configuration option to disable caching altogether. For example, I can export a constant called dynamic and set its value to host dynamic. This will tell Nextjs that do not catch anything, just calculate every time whenever the request comes and then send back the response. Okay, so we have basically looked at 4 of the scenarios in which the caching is disabled automatically. Now there is just one problem with all of these 4 ways is that they either disable the caching altogether or they enable the caching. And you know probably that caching is very good for performance. So what you can do, you can enable caching and you can then tell Next.js to revalidate those requests after a certain period of time. So this way you'll be getting the performance boost of caching, and then you won't have to basically worry about that user will be getting some really outdated data. So let me show you what I mean by that. So we already saw in the beginning itself that whenever your route handler receives a get request and you are using a response object to return a response, that is going to get cached. So what you can do in your fetch request, you can pass a configuration object that has this property called next, and this next property accepts an object. Inside of this object you can set the revalidate value, and this value is in basically seconds. And what I'm essentially saying is that after every 60 seconds, and with this what I'm essentially saying is that after every 60 seconds just revalidate the data. Essentially get the fresh data by making a fresh request to this endpoint and then return back that response. And similar to this next revalidate, you can also set a route segment configuration option like this, and this will revalidate all of the request after 60 seconds. You also have this option of redirecting user to a particular page or something whenever they try to make a get request to this particular route segment. So first we will import a redirect from next navigation, and then we'll specify in which URL we want to redirect the user whenever we receive the get request. So let's see if this works or not. Now, if you are building an API endpoint, you are going to encounter one of these scenarios in which you want to get the query parameters, you want to get the body object, or you want to get the form data. So these are essentially the ways through which you can basically get the necessary data that you want. So in order to get the query parameters, we can use request.nextURL.search params. The first thing you will notice here is that TypeScript is complaining to us that property next URL does not exist on type request. And if you remember, in the beginning, I've said that Next.js has advanced version of these request and response object in which we get some extra methods. So I just have to tell TypeScript that this request is an instance of next request, and make sure we import the type next request from here, and then TypeScript won't complain about this. So this way we can get the query parameters. If you want to get the request body, this is how you do it. And if you want to get the form data, this is how you do it. All right, guys, that's all for this video. If you found this video valuable or helpful in any way, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll catch you in the next one.